before we had all these cities with all these lights and electricity, when you looked up in the sky, you could see like the Milky Way galaxy and just the impressive awe of the cosmos. And there's something I saw on the rock that I couldn't tell what it was. I didn't know if it was a stick or a rock or an animal. And in that moment that I had that thought, a lizard, it was a lizard, its head, and it turned and looked directly at me. My brother not only lacked social connection, he clearly must have lacked faith. Faith, from my perspective, is understanding that ultimately everything is on the path towards growth. You know, if I were to keep a dog in a cage, starve it, and poke it with a stick, it would be pretty dishonest to say that it had behavior problems. And in heaven, everyone's sitting around a 10-foot table with 10-foot chopsticks, unable to feed themselves, but they're not trying to feed themselves. They're trying to feed each other. Again, with my brother, I knew him. I knew a lot of his struggles, but I still didn't know that he was standing on a ledge, basically. If I would have known he was standing on the ledge, I would have brought him in. All right, thanks for joining me on this hike. What I wanted to talk about today is something that I haven't talked about. I kind of wanted to flesh out why. I'm not entirely sure, so I'm going to kind of think out loud while I walk, because I found hiking and walking with intention, trying to work through a particular thought, is helpful. Now, with my brother's suicide, one of the things that I've been focusing on in talking about, and something that's been just, I've been thinking about, is connection to other people, and how, our modern world gives us the illusion of connection through technology, but we have the absence of physical face-to-face connection, which of course is how we evolved for 99.9999999% of our existence as a species. We're hardwired to interact with each other in person, not via screens. I digress. There's another aspect of a fulfilled life that I didn't come to realize, and I'm still realizing it more, but that's faith and spirituality. Now, I think in part, I've been reluctant to talk about this, despite my own personal exploration, again, in particular over the last 2 years. It's because I used to be an atheist, and of course our society certainly doesn't look at organized religion with any kind of fondness. So I've been exploring, and the reason I've been exploring is because one day when I was hiking at a mountain I've recorded many times, and I sure hope this wind cover is doing its job, but at a mountain I've recorded many times, I was doing a hike. It was a 3.2 mile out and back hike, up and down hike to a cave on the face of a mountain. And I had recently quit smoking cigarettes, so naturally my lungs weren't good. I also was climbing out of the worst depression I've personally been in, and I maybe weighed like 135 pounds. Right now I'm about 195, just to give you some idea. So I was not in good hiking shape, but I'd been on a few hikes. I'd strengthened myself a little bit, and I was really working on kind of the mental aspect, but breathing in particular is something I was really focusing on. And we'll see, I may give a little explanation on that in this video, or that may be a future video as well. But on this particular hike, on this particular day, I decided that I was going to really focus on nasal breathing. And if you're not aware or familiar, just in short, we're supposed to breathe with our nose. You have various means of filtering, climate control, and overall efficiency. But for a number of reasons in modern life, we've sort of turned into a bunch of mouth breathers, and our skulls actually change, and everything, the nose and the mouth actually change shape to accommodate being a mouth breather. I know I personally have kind of that elongated face, and I catch myself, with my mouth open, especially when I sleep. I will get to working on remedying this, but this is a tangent. My point is, this particular day I was breathing through my nose, and the way I was going to accomplish it was by holding water in my mouth. Now, if you've ever done this, you'll know that the water gets gross real quick. The inside of your mouth is a warm place. But I was going, and I didn't have to come to a complete stop. I was doing a pretty good job as far as modulating my pace so that I could breathe through my nose. But I finally hit a point on the trail where I just could not go any further breathing through my nose. And I swallowed the water, and I sat down, began panting through my mouth. And as I was kind of leaning over my knees, I looked to my right. There's this nice mossy covered rock. And there's something I saw on the rock that I couldn't tell what it was. I didn't know if it was a stick or a rock or an animal. And in that moment that I had that thought, it was a lizard, its head, and it turned and looked directly at me. And we made eye contact, and this is gonna sound however it's gonna sound to you, but in that moment, everything made sense. I was able to see an interconnectedness and an overall plan involved, or sort of behind, almost like a divine plan behind everything that had happened in my life and that was happening in the world. And again, it was for a moment. It was just this instantaneous moment where it was like God said peekaboo and revealed himself to me. Now, I can dive further into that particular experience, but what I kind of wanted to do was to branch a little into the very notion of being able to have an experience like that and not have it attributed to some form of mental illness. So, first and foremost, I don't think I'm special. I don't think that's why I had the experience, and that in any way I am special. I think this experience is something that everyone can have, and I think it's an experience that people used to have more regularly. There's a Greek word called theophany, and this is essentially God revealing himself to an individual. You know, the story of Moses in the burning bush would be an example of theophany. There's many reasons why I believe I had that experience. So aside from recently having made the decision to live, and again, I'm talking about several years ago here, I was very diligent about my hydration. I was very diligent about eating cleaner foods. And I was obsessed with meditation, in particular, at particular times of day. I don't remember how many days in a row I did, but every day at the sunrise, which changes every day, I would meditate before and during. So it was like 15 minutes before the sun came up, I would start, and about 15 minutes after it came up, I would finish. And I started feeling very connected to God, to source, to the universe. You know, I'm still not entirely sure what language I want to use for my understanding of things. But I do believe God is a good word, and I think it's something that we need to bring back and not be afraid of, despite whatever baggage people may have associated with it. So just to pause, when I'm speaking of God, I'm talking about the all of alls, the everything of everythings. So everything contained is God. It is that aggregate. We're all individuated fragments of God. These plants, these rocks, you know, the cacti, the animals, all of that is individual expressions of God for the purpose of observing, learning, and growing, which is what I believe the function of the universe essentially is, which we are, again, that part of. Now, that's going to sound however that's going to sound. I mean, this is a video that, I don't know, it's going to seem, I guess, pretty far away from suicide prevention, but I'm trying to tie it all together here, if you'll hopefully bear with me. But by quieting the outside world, which is one of the biggest problems we have in modern society, okay, this is why we're so detached from spirit. You know, for example, we have all the light pollution, so that when we look up in the sky, it's mostly black, aside from a few stars. Whereas if you understand a little bit, you know that before we had all these cities with all these lights and electricity, when you looked up in the sky, you could see like the Milky Way galaxy and just the impressive awe of the cosmos. But we're robbed of that now. And so instead of looking up in wonder, we look down and doom scroll, right? We've overcomplicated the elegant and simple. It's by recognizing how to quiet the things around us. All of the digital stimuli, the electrical stimuli with the lights and the sounds. And by intentionally quieting those things through meditation, through hiking, through other contemplative acts, you'll start to hear things. And I don't mean hear as an auditory, I'm just using that as a word to make it a little easier to understand, but you'll hear God. You'll begin to see God. Now, I had another experience in my life that was pretty instrumental, but nowhere near as powerful as the experience I spoke about hiking, because when I was hiking, I was completely sober. But I had another experience where God said peekaboo to me while on DMT, how long? Maybe a little over a decade ago. And that was a very interesting experience. I got into psychedelics a bit later. Well, not really, I guess, because I first started experimenting with psilocybin mushrooms when I was maybe like 16, 17, but I never enjoyed them. I didn't do it that often, but I had bad trips. I had a crazy experience on Halloween in Madison, Wisconsin. And for those of you that are familiar with what Halloween in Madison, Wisconsin used to be like, imagine a bad trip on mushrooms in that environment. Anyway, but later in life, I ended up dabbling a little bit more and experimenting with DMT, LSD, etc. And over the course of that, I had various profound moments despite my lack of intention. You know, it wasn't entirely profound. I was still a practicing alcoholic at the time, but it forced me to learn, which is why a lot of people think of these substances as teachers, which I'm inclined to believe. I mean, if you look at sort of the evolution of everything, hydrogen is about the oldest thing that we know of. I mean, not even hydrogen, you break it down further, but it's hard not to say that chemicals are perhaps teachers. Anyway, another topic for another day. The point is, my brother not only lacked social connection, he clearly must have lacked faith. Now, I know that he enjoyed singing. We grew up Christian, okay? We grew up Lutheran. And I know he enjoyed Christian music, you know, like the overtly Christian music. And he would sing to it. He sung in church when we were kids and we went with our dad. But if he had faith, he wouldn't have taken his own life, because he would have known that there was more to his story. And so that's sort of the reason I wanted to, or why I thought it was time and it was important to bring up faith and spirituality, because in the absence of close friends, good family relationships, you know, an overall support network, faith can be incredibly powerful. Personally, due to my own battles with suicidal depression, I've created a life that doesn't have very many people in it. Now, I've recently began working on expanding it, because the loss of my brother has let me know I cannot do this life alone. There are benefits and there are things that everyone should experience through solitude, that you can only experience through solitude. Lessons that can only be taught that way. But I don't think it's a way to live life. And not that I ever did, it's just you get kind of into a habit and into a routine. and things just get easier. So anyway, faith, from my perspective, is understanding that ultimately everything is on the path towards growth. It may not necessarily seem that way from our limited perspective. Again, back to the analogy of a baby learning to walk. You know, we may see the baby falling and say, well, that's evidence that they don't know how to walk and they're not learning how to walk, because every time they try, they fall. But the wiser position, the wiser perspective, is that every time they get back up, they're strengthening those little baby leg muscles, and with enough strengthening, they will be able to walk. So, faith, in part, enables you to see that in the world around you. There's a lot of negative aspects about society, in particular, just to stick with, where I live and what I know best, America. I not that I had a YouTube channel or publicly talked about any of this, but I've been trying to explain how America is, we don't have a culture, we have a culture. And this is in part because you have to understand, I guess, geopolitical game theory, right? So just to go off on this tangent real quick, the United States spends more money on its military than every other nation combined, right? More tanks, more aircraft, more battleships, etc. It would be foolish if you were another nation or interest, maybe a multinational conglomerate or asset management company, and you wanted to topple the United States, which maybe you wanted to do for various reasons, like our unique codified position on free speech or the amount of guns we have per capita, things like this. So if you were to want to topple the United States, it would be foolish to attack physically, because again, you don't have the tanks, you don't have the soldiers, you don't have the bombs, you don't have the aircraft, etc. But what you would have logic to do is to subvert the population and have them tear themselves apart, which I think there's ample evidence for. And I can't remember the KGB defector who recorded a video, or who was recorded on video, I want to say in like the 90s maybe, Yuri Bezmenov or something along those lines. But he essentially explained a multi-generational process that was being used, and destabilization of America has resulted in deaths of despair rising by 20% per year ever since, I want to say like 2018, so like the last 5 years. I might be slightly off on those numbers. Now, deaths of despair, that's going to be suicide. This is going to be accidental overdose, because obviously an intentional overdose is a suicide. So an accidental overdose, and then alcohol-related deaths. There seems to be, and this has been going on for years, but there seems to be a concerted effort to take down the United States with the understanding that it is a unique place on this planet. And it's unique from a philosophical perspective that we really need to protect and that we need to grow as individuals so that we're capable of protecting. The Berlin Wall was an edifice that people were willing to die trying to get over, because on the other side of it was freedom. But if there doesn't exist freedom anywhere, there's no wall for us to climb over, what happens then? And what I fear when I look around me and I see, again, this increase in these rates of despair, I have my own personal story, my own anecdotes throughout life about various societal messaging and how it led me astray. I question, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? Why are all of us so complicit in this? One of the things that I've explained to various people over the years is, if you change incentives, you can change people's behavior. Because people are largely incentive driven. Through this process, people become complicit in various top-down planning without any knowledge of their own. It's a form of compartmentalization, if you will. And so what happens is the people how do I say this? One of the things that Solzhenitsyn, I'm saying that name wrong, from Gulag Archipelago, who wrote that, what he talked about with the Soviet Union was lies. Everyone was complicit in lying. And in order to regain our sense of self, to move forward, to grow, we need to refine that. And we need to stop lying and begin telling the truth no matter the cost. Now the cost is getting heavier and heavier, more and more expensive, but we need to speak it because, again, just to pull it back to mental health, excuse me, my mom said something the other day, and I corrected her from my perspective. She said it took a long time, because we were talking about destigmatizing suicide and depression, etc., and how we could possibly go about it. And she was saying it took her a long time to acknowledge that she had mental illness. And I corrected her from, again, my perspective, and I said, I don't think you have mental illness, I think you're human. I think we try to pretend, essentially what the pharmaceutical paradigm states is that if you have a problem in your environment, in the world, that problem lies with you. But that ignores something pretty obvious. What about our environment? You know, if I were to keep a dog in a cage, starve it, and poke it with a stick, it would be pretty dishonest to say that it had behavior problems. It was conditioned to behave that way. And many human beings, all of us to some extent, are conditioned to behave in maladaptive ways. Now, the only way this gets fixed is by reflecting, contemplating, observing yourself, raising your awareness, and intentionally choosing growth. Again, with the understanding that a baby needs to fall in order to be strong enough to actually walk. Don't let the powers that be, the people that have profited off of our despair, tell you lies that our interests as the peasant class don't align. Because they do. We all have way more in common with each other than we do with any of these slick talking mouthpieces for multinational corporations. A lot of my battle with depression and suicidality, I projected out onto the world around me as to the root of my problems. And in doing so, I was able to find many very real problems. You know, a debt-based economy. It's interesting what that's done. You know, you can look currently at the petrodollar about to end, which means the US's position as a global reserve currency ends, which means the dollar really collapses, which means the US really crumbles and society fully destabilizes. Unless we actually talk about it, plan for it, and do what humans are capable of actually doing, which is creative and lateral thinking in order to solve problems. But instead, we'd rather distract ourselves. Life is hard enough. I can't even fault anyone for distracting themselves. I distract myself too. But I'm doing, in this video, in this stream of consciousness, I'm doing what I've done prior to when I actually experienced some relief from that mental anguish that troubled me my whole life. And that was, instead of focusing on these external things that I have no control over, let's say, let's say I'm right about a particular agenda from a particular source. I can't affect that. Certainly not presently. But what I can do is I can work on my temper. I can work on my emotional regulation as a whole. You know, one thing that I've learned, and I'll note that I don't really think that life lessons can be taught, they can only be learned. So I'll try to say things I've picked up along the way, but ultimately we need to experience these things for ourselves. Which way do I want to go? I think I'll go this way. And then lose my train of thought. Well, we'll see if it comes back to me. The reason you need to abandon the mental energy that you spend on externalities outside of your control is for that very reason. They're outside of your control and you have limited energy. You know, every second you're spending thinking about the Federal Reserve or, endless wars overseas, you name it, the less time you're thinking about how you can show your family that you love them, how you can, better teach your children life lessons, how you can do something for your community, in general, how you can be of service to others. Which reminds me of what I sort of envision when I think of ultimately where we're going to get to as a species. And I'd love it to be sooner than later, but I got a feeling it's going to be way, way later, no matter what. But I want to say it's Confucius who talked about it, but essentially there was someone who asked, what's the difference between heaven and hell? And he said, in hell, everyone is sitting around a 10-foot table with 10-foot chopsticks, unable to feed themselves. And in heaven, everyone's sitting around a 10-foot table with 10-foot chopsticks, unable to feed themselves, but they're not trying to feed themselves. They're trying to feed each other, for which these 10-foot chopsticks are perfect. And when I envision the ideal human society, that's what I envision. Instead of me worrying about me, I worry about you. And it's in this way that we all take care of each other. And I think that this fundamental shift, it wouldn't lead to lesser personal development, it would lead to more. Because if I were to be looking out for someone else, I would be encouraging them to explore their interests and pursue their passions. I'd be encouraging them to, pick up healthy habits and abandon bad habits. Theoretically, this is what we should be doing for ourselves, but it's all too easy not to, right? For a number of reasons, we all end up slightly maladaptive, and that's part of the job of us as individuals in this individuated conscious experience is to grow through that. But I think collectively, the way that we grow through that is, again, by shifting that focus. Instead of trying to feed ourselves, we try to feed each other. And that's what I'm going to be attempting to do, as I get the charity off the ground. I mean, there's a whole lot of legwork. There's a whole lot of, there's costs involved. It's not just a given when you say, hey, I want to start a charity to help a worthwhile cause. It's not like it just happens right away. Especially, again, when you're me and you haven't networked. Or rather, you've, completely destroyed and abandoned any semblance of a network. So, how do we do this? How do we make this world better with the understanding that it's going to get better, again, through faith? How do we then recognize our individual roles in order to make that happen? Again, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer, but fundamentally, painting in broad strokes, it takes quieting the modern world so that you can be receptive. Whether you want to believe that the answers are coming from God, Spirit, Source, the universe, or you want to believe that the answers are coming from your subconscious or some other aspect of your own mind, it's ultimately pretty irrelevant, because the reality is by quieting your mind and being receptive, you will get answers. You will get knowledge and wisdom. And I have a tendency to like putting together little elegant phrases. And one of the ones that kind of popped in my mind, as I'm losing it now, never mind. My brain is having a hard time focusing, which I guess I might as well explain partially why. So I had done a at-home ketamine treatment to help me come back from my depression. I was initially in the immediate sort of crisis moments. I was on your standard pharmaceutical medications because there wasn't really known what else to do in that moment. I had also admitted myself to a facility, and of course that's what they were going to do, is prescribe that. And you know, I got all the side effects, and I've talked in another video about my particular opinion, including based on, you know, the meta-analysis that was done last summer of 2022. But I knew I wasn't going to be on those things long term. However, ketamine isn't like SSRIs. It works on the glutamate system. And long story short, poor man's, you know, college dropout explanation of this is that excessive exposure to cortisol as a result of trauma, post-traumatic stress, complex PTSD, etc., will result in a shriveling of components of a neuron known as dendrites, which is sort of this bushy cluster, which an axon, which is, it's like a singular fiber they attach to. And this is in part how, you know, the electrochemical messaging is sent between neurons. Now, what glutamate is it is the primary excitatory neurotransmitter, so sort of the counterpoint to GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, which is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. GABA, high levels of GABA will make you significantly less anxious. You know, some of the videos, if you see me walking around the tops of mountains, some people may think, wow, what is he doing? That looks so scary. But to me, I'm very calm. It's because of high levels of GABA, right? Now, glutamate, what this is doing is this is actually helping the regrowth of the dendrites so that the axons can connect. And so you have more neuronal activity, more connections. The purpose of this is to increase your plasticity of your mind, that neuroplasticity that we've all heard so much about over the last handful of years. Now, my thinking individually was, if I combine my hiking, which again moves my eyes laterally, which releases acetylcholine, which helps me enter a neuroplastic state, and I combine that with ketamine, it will really help me process my brother's grief, and it will help me alchemize this experience into being of greater good and service to humanity, because it's one of the biggest things I feel, having lost my brother, is I have not been anywhere near compassionate enough to other people. I've been so caught up in my own world that, you know, I've lashed out in anger at complete strangers for virtually nothing. And it's not because I'm intending to be a mean person who does these types of things, but I've done these types of things. And again, with my brother, I knew him. I knew a lot of his struggles, but I still didn't know that he was standing on a ledge, basically. If I would have known he was standing on the ledge, I would have brought him in, right? That's why faith and community are such important aspects of life that we've essentially neglected entirely in modern society. You know, community is a Facebook group, or it's a YouTube video. Like, it's not, we don't interact with people anymore the way that we used to. 2020 and the events of it almost took that away from us in a much bigger way for a much longer time. And thankfully, that stopped. Although I wouldn't be surprised if there's efforts to make that come back. Heavy effects from that on developing minds. We've evolved to see faces in a particular way. You know, that a mask distorts. screens, again, are not the same as face-to-face interaction. You're not getting all of the chemistry that takes place when you're around another human being. What we're gonna see, unless we start really focusing on this, which you would think a society that claims to love its children would focus on this. But what we're gonna see is these children turning into adults. I mean, it's already began, where they lack empathy, where they feel as though they're the main character in the world's movie. And as a result, we just get more and more apathetic treatment of each other, which leads to more and more problems, more and more maladaption. And it's just this endless cycle to the bottom of despair. Again, if we don't find our way out. I'm running out of time. I got to make my way back to the car. So I think I'm going to just abruptly wrap things up there. I don't know. If I posted this, know that I debated because of the topic of conversation. I wouldn't be surprised if... Anyway, maybe not the most conventional thinking, but I think it's accurate, and I hopefully explained myself well enough. That all being said, I appreciate you. Call someone, hug someone, be of service. We'll see you next time. Peace.